Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "He who fights with monsters should look into it, that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." These words capture the paradox of self-destruction, a wonder that has haunted human existence across time. Self-destruction is not just an act, it is a philosophy, a way of thinking, a condition of being that emerges when one reaches the end of meaning. It can manifest in the individual, in society, in culture, and even in civilization itself. The purpose of today's video is to explore the nature of self-destruction from a philosophical standpoint, drawing from existentialism, nihilism, psychoanalysis, and metaphysics to understand why humans are sometimes drawn to their own ruin. Self-destruction, at its core, is the deliberate or subconscious movement towards annihilation, whether physical, psychological, or spiritual. It is paradoxical in nature because while life is predicated on survival, the will to destroy one's self also exists as an undeniable force. Philosophers throughout history have pondered the tension between the instinct to live and the impulse to self-destruct. Arthur Schopenhauer, a philosopher of pessimism, argued that life is suffering and that the will to live is just an instinctive blind force, or as he says, life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and boredom. For Schopenhauer, the desire to seize existence is an unavoidable consequence of realizing the futility of life. In many ways, self-destruction can be viewed as the logical endpoint of an exhausted will, a final rejection of a reality that offers only suffering and disappointment. Sigmund Freud, in his theory of the death drive, suggested that humans possess an unconscious drive towards self-destruction, a force that counteracts the life-preserving instincts of Eros. The goal of all life is death, Freud argued, proposing that organisms inherently seek to return to an lifeless state. This notion, this idea of this death drive, presents a biological and psychological underpinning to the philosophy of self-destruction, making it not just a choice, but a fundamental part of the human psyche. Self-destruction is closely linked to nihilism, the belief that life lacks inherent meaning, value, or purpose. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of the dangers of nihilism, stating, "What does nihilism mean? That the highest values devalue themselves. The aim is lacking. Why finds no answer." When meaning collapses, when belief structures crumble, self-destruction often follows a reaction to the unbearable void. Dostoevsky's novel Notes from Underground explores this condition in depth. The protagonist, an unnamed man consumed by self-loathing and resentment, engages in acts of self-destruction as a means of asserting control in a meaningless world. He refuses happiness because it is, in his view, a lie. He embraces suffering because it is the only authentic experience left. This radical embrace of suffering is a common theme in philosophical discussions on self-destruction. If life is absurd, as Albert Camus argues in the myth of Sisyphus, then is self-destruction not a valid response? Camus, however, offers an alternative perspective. While he acknowledges the absurdity of existence, he urges us to revolt against meaninglessness by affirming life despite its lack of inherent purpose. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, he writes. In this sense, self-destruction is both the temptation and the test of existential philosophy. To surrender is to give in to nihilism. To persist is to defy it. Human history is filled with examples of figures who have turned self-destruction into an art form, from the tragic poets who drank themselves to death to the philosophers who wrestled with their own madness. Destruction has often been romanticized. There is a certain beauty in the idea of the doomed artist, the tormented genius who burns brightly only to extinguish themselves. Consider the works of Edgar Allan Poe, Sylvia Plath, and Virginia Woolf, each of whom grappled with themes of despair and ultimately surrendered to their own inner darkness. Their suffering became part of their art, their self-destruction embedded into their legacy. But does this idealization mask a deeper sickness? The aesthetics of self-destruction can be both seductive and dangerous, as it can obscure the real pain that underlies it. Self-destruction is not confined to individuals. Societies and civilizations have engaged in their own forms of self-annihilation. The fall of Rome, the collapse of empires, and the self-sabotage of nations all speak to the broader implications of this phenomenon. Karl Marx, in his critique of capitalism, warned of the system's self-destructive tendencies, predicting that it would eventually undermine itself through its own contradictions. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win, he declared, implying that self-destruction could also be a revolutionary act and one that leads to rebirth rather than just destruction. In the same sense, Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West presents history as a cycle of cultural exhaustion where civilizations decay under the weight of their own success. When a society reaches a point where it can no longer sustain itself, self-destruction becomes a collective destiny. Is self-destruction an act of cowardice or an assertion of ultimate freedom? Existentialists like Jean-Paul Satre and Camus faced this question. While Satre argued that absolute freedom includes the right to end one's existence, Camus countered with the idea that rebellion against suffering is the greater act of defiance. Buddhism offers yet another perspective. Suffering arises from attachment, and self-destruction is a misunderstanding of the path to liberation. True enlightenment, according to Buddhist teachings, comes not from self-destruction, but from transcending yourself. In this view, self-destruction is an error, a failure to see beyond suffering to a greater truth. To destroy oneself is to engage with the fundamental questions of existence. It is both an act of despair and paradoxically an act of ultimate agency. The philosophy of self-destruction makes us look into our fears, our limitations, and our place in an indifferent universe. As Nietzsche said, what does not kill me makes me stronger. Perhaps in wrestling with self-destruction, we find a way to affirm life, not through blind optimism, but through a deeper, more nuanced understanding of suffering and endurance. In the end, the choice remains to be consumed by the abyss or to stare into it and, against all odds, continue to exist.